Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one there are developments in the northeastern section of the front line as well as the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region. The Russians have managed to capture a significant portion of the border area in the northeastern parts of the Kharkiv region, expanding the zone of control beyond that of Milove and along the Oskil River line. The Russians also continued offensive operations in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, where they have managed to expand their zone of control north of Shevchenko, gaining control over additional fortified positions here to the south of Voskresenka. Russians are slowly pushing to gain full control over the fortified positions bit by bit, where fighting continues over the fortifications north of Shevchenko and near Voskresenka, while the Russians are looking to cut off the Ukrainian forces present north of these fortified positions to flank the town of Voskresenka from the rear. The Russians are already fighting over these positions from multiple directions. The Russians now almost have full control over the fortified line here north of Shevchenko. This significantly improves their supply capability of their forces from Velika Novosilka along the Mokrieli river line towards Myrne and Pidupne. At the same time, the Russians also continued offensive operations within Pidupne, gaining control over the southern parts of the town, flanking the fortified positions of the Ukrainians in the area, which is now contested. This is to flank Myrne from the rear and storm it from both the southern and northern flanks. The Russians can also launch offensive operations from across the river line in the direction of Kumar towards Myrne. The Russians are here gaining control over the settlements in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region at an increased pace, where their main offensive operations taking place along the highway itself, with the bridge blown in the direction of Andrivka-Klevtsove. The Russians will look to isolate the remaining parts and gain full control of them, which will support the offensive operations into the Dnipropetrovsk region and to flank the fortified positions in the Zaporizhia region direction. Gaining control over these remaining parts will free up Russian forces for the offensive operations towards Novopavlivka and to flank the fortified positions of the Ukrainians in the first and second lines of defense in the Zaporizhia direction, opening up for offensive operations in the direction of Pokrovsk to the west and the logistical hubs in the north. This will strengthen the offensive operations towards Pokrovsk in the coming weeks. In the northeastern parts of the Kharkiv region, the Russians significantly expanded the zone of control around the town of Milove, gaining control over several forest patch areas. The Russians now control approximately 25 square kilometers along the border area here in the direction of Milove, where they are gaining control over several positions along the border area, expanding the zone of control likely to connect it with their forces along the Oskil River line, and then move along the highway. What we're seeing is that the Russians are working along the river line beyond that of Topoli, getting control over the road leading and connecting Topoli with Stroivka. At the same time, we see through the control over Kamyanka, the Russians can launch offensive operations towards Kolodiesne, and this is also connected to roads in the direction of Milove, where the Russians can connect their forces in the south and the north, encircling the Ukrainian forces in the forward villages along the border area and pushing towards the logistical hubs of the Ukrainians in this section of the front line, which means the Russians will likely intensify their offensive operations in the direction of Vyholivka, gain control over that, and advance along the road to the north, along from Kamyanska and Verishna, where the objective is to gain control over the settlements along these roads, a wide section of the border area, to establish themselves with a foothold along the border section, for which the Russians can expand their offensive operations alongside the highway towards the intersection that connects the three highways from the Verishna, the border area to the east, and the border area in the direction of Vovchansk to the west. The Russian advance here in the direction of Topoli and Stroivka allowed them to gain control over the roads connecting Stroivka down here towards Topoli, as well as some forest patches along the Oskil River line, connecting the Russian bridgehead across the Oskil River line from Topoli in the north all the way down to Kupiansk in the south. The Russians will here look to gain control over Kupiansk as they expand their zone of control along the Oskar line and expand their offensive operations in the area. It is clear that the Russians are facing a lot of issues with the Ukrainian forces, strengthening their positions in the area. However, we see that the Ukrainians are being spread thinly across the front line, and with the additional offensive operations in the southern section of the front line along Zaporizhia and the Ukrainian forces being rotated to different sections of the front line, Russians will look for a gap for these offensive operations. They recently captured the positions near Polyubivka and are fighting in the direction of Kinderashivka and Arkivka to open up the roads to the north of Kupiansk, with additional offensive operations taking place in the direction of Petropavlivka, Kocherivka, and the northern flank of the eastern parts of Kupiansk, which indicates an offensive operations going in the direction of Kupiansk from the north. At the same time, there were advances by the Russians to the direction of Lishkivka to the south at the end of last month, which could indicate offensive operations taking place in the southern flank as well, as the Russians will look to gain control over the eastern bank near Kupiansk, and then Kupiansk itself, which will establish yet another logistical hub for the Russian forces on the western bank of the Oskar line. Which brings me to my analysis from the previous video where I talk about a Russian offensive towards Izium. What I'm saying is not that the Russians will launch an operation across the border and within a few days capture Izium. Instead, what I'm saying is that as we see along the border area, the Russians are creating their so-called buffer zone. The Russians will expand its offensive operations alongside the border area to gain control over the border area and then launch offensive operations similar to the south and the east, where the Russians are slowly advancing along the front line to gain control over the defensive lines of the Ukrainians, fortified positions and settlements that can be used for a springboard for further offensive operations by the Russians, expanding their front line, taking advantage of their numerical superiority and the Ukrainian lack of weapons to expand the zone of control, which will spread out the Ukrainian forces even further, despite the already lack of frontline personnel. This will allow Russians to speed up offensive operations all across the front line, and will likely see additional such pushes along the border area from the Kharkiv region in the south to the Chernihiv region in the north, simply to spread out the Ukrainian forces. And whenever the Ukrainians launch a counterattack at a section of the front line, relocating elite forces and the majority of their weapons to one section of the front line to gain an advantage there, the Russians will launch an additional offensive operation in other sections of the front line to spread out the Ukrainian forces and strengthen their own positions. While this game of cat and mouse continues on the wider section of the front line and the Russians start additional pushes across the border area, the Russians also consider offensive operations in the Chesev Yar direction in the direction of Kashinivka, generally to improve their positions around the city for the operational encirclement. According to the latest reports, the Russians have started storming Predeshchene. Some reports even suggest that the Russians have gained full control over the settlement, which would mean that the Russians are slowly gaining control over the frontline positions necessary for their operational encirclement over the city. That is according to the Russian Ministry of Defense. At the same time, we've seen the recent capture of Mykolaiivka by the Russian forces, which indicates a offensive being launched by the Russian forces. If they're able to gain control of these frontline positions over the next coming days to a week, then the Ukrainian positions near Kashinivka would have significantly deteriorated following these developments. What we're seeing is that the Russians are intensifying defensive operations in areas that are being underrepresented by the Ukrainian forces, especially following the results of the operational encirclement here west of Donetsk. The Ukrainian defensive capabilities have been significantly weakened as a result of this. They have to use a lot of their supplies and available manpower to fight through this operational encirclement. However, they have yet to free up their personnel under the siege. With additional advances to the east, the Ukrainian positions continue to deteriorate in this section of the front line. Finally, the Russians also launched a massive airstrike on Ukrainian positions, especially Kiev, where the Russians launched over 500 drones on Ukrainian territory. According to the Ukrainians, they shot down a lot of them, but with 500 launched, a significant amount still manages to come through. In addition to this, additional cruise missiles and ballistic missiles were launched on Ukrainian positions. So we see a continuous air campaign by the Russian forces at the same time as these frontline developments take place. Putin and Trump talked on the telephone yesterday. From this conversation, they really didn't achieve anything diplomatically through the war in Ukraine. Instead, they talked mostly about economic opportunities and cooperation between the two countries after the war. While the war itself, the Trump asked about a swift end to it. Putin said he will not give up on his goals with the war and that he's open for diplomatic solution as long as those goals are achieved. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.